After her husband's burial, the daughter-in-law kicked her mother-in-law out of the house, wanting her apartment. However, when the time came for the will, she was paralyzed and floored by what she heard. The small apartment where Augusto spent his last days was plunged into an uncomfortable silence. The walls adorned with family photos seemed to absorb the tension that floated in the air. Esperanza stood by the window, staring at the street, trying to control the anger that boiled inside her. Dona Antonia, sitting in a worn armchair, held a frame with a photo of Augusto, her eyes full of sadness and determination. "This apartment is mine by right," Dona Antonia began. Esperanza's voice trembled with indignation. "Augusto was my husband, and I took care of him until his last breath. It is the least I deserve." Dona Antonia looked up, tears shining in her eyes, but her voice came out firm and controlled. "Augusto and I bought this apartment long before you appeared, Esperanza. The money came from our savings. You can say that she was his wife, but that doesn't give you the right to everything he had," Esperanza retorted, stepping forward, anger overflowing. "I sacrificed everything for him. I worked tirelessly to support this family while fighting that disease. Do you think you have more rights than me?" Dona Antonia stood up, facing Esperanza as an equal, the pain transforming into an unbreakable force. "You never did that for love, Esperanza. It was always about what you could win. I saw how you acted when Augusto got sick. You were more worried about the money." The accusation hit Esperanza like a punch. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "How dare you," she whispered, her voice low and full of venom. "You think you know everything, right? But you know nothing. Augusto was my husband, and I fought by his side until the end." Dona Antonia came closer, the anger finally overflowing. "And that's why he entrusted the apartment to me, to make sure you didn't keep anything. You think I don't know about your plans? Always trying to manipulate the situation in your favor." The room fell silent, the tension almost tangible. Esperanza panted, looking at Dona Antonia with a mixture of hate and desperation. "You don't understand, Dona Antonia. I loved Augusto, and he loved me. He wanted me to have a safe life, a home. And you're trying to take that away from me." Dona Antonia shook her head slowly, sadness mixed with disappointment. "I'm not trying to take anything away from you, Esperanza. I just want to make sure that what Augusto and I built together is respected. And that means protecting this apartment from your hands." A tear ran down Esperanza's face, but she quickly wiped it away. "It must be that nothing I did was worth it," she thought, her heart clenched. With each word from Dona Antonia, the truth seemed to move further away. "You will never forgive me, right?" said Esperanza, her voice now a whisper of desperation. "No matter what I do, you will always see me as an intruder." Dona Antonia sighed deeply, tiredness evident on her face. "It's not about forgiveness, Esperanza. It's about justice. Augusto entrusted me with this place because he knew that I would take care of him. I just want to honor that trust." Esperanza turned abruptly, looking at the window once more. How can she be so blind, she thought, frustration growing. She doesn't see that I only want what is fair. "You are wrong, Mrs. Antonia," said Esperanza, her voice full of determination. "I am not going to give up so easily. I am going to fight for this apartment, for my right, and nothing you say will change that." Mrs. Antonia did not respond immediately. She looked at the photo of Augusto in her hands, her eyes full of memories. Finally, she got up, looking towards Esperanza with a soft but firm voice. "Do what you think is best, Esperanza. But remember, the truth always prevails, and the love that Augusto had for us is what matters, not the walls of this apartment." Esperanza felt a wave of conflicting emotions. She must be right, she thought, but quickly pushed the thought away. She didn't have to fight for Augusto for herself, she couldn't give up now. "So be it," Dona Antonia said, her cold voice steady. We will see who deserves this place. The tension in the room seemed almost palpable. Both women knew that the battle had just begun, and each was determined to fight to the end. Esperanza's mind wandered as she looked out the window, remembering the early days of her relationship with Augusto. The noise of the city in the background seemed distant, like an echo of a past that she desperately wanted to relive. Augusto and I met at the university, where Dona Antonia began. Esperanza turned to look at her mother-in-law. He was so full of life, with dreams and plans. Remember how he spoke about changing the world? Mrs. Antonia nodded, her soft gaze momentarily distant. Yes, he was always a dreamer, she answered with a heavy sigh. Esperanza closed her eyes, letting the memories flood her mind. She remembered the first meeting with Augusto in the university library. He was sitting at a table surrounded by books, with a smile that lit up the room. He asked her out after seeing her in the library. She was so nervous but at the same time felt a trust in him. Esperanza smiled at the memory. That was how everything was. Dona Antonia began looking at Esperanza, trying to see the truth behind her words. She had always had her doubts about Esperanza, even in Augusto's happiest days. I remember him. He was so in love, but I've always wondered what you saw in him. Esperanza felt her heart shrink at the implicit accusation. I loved him, Dona Antonia. I still love him. He was everything to me, she said with a firm voice but full of emotion. The memories continued to flow. Esperanza and Augusto shared moments of joy and also difficulty. She remembered when Augusto lost his job and how she assumed the responsibility of maintaining the house. We went through difficult times, but we were always there for each other. I worked hard to maintain the house when he lost his job, added Esperanza, trying to show the depth of her dedication. Dona Antonia, however, was not convinced. You have always worked hard, Esperanza, but I have always wondered if you did it for love or something more, said Dona Antonia, her words laden with suspicion. Esperanza felt tears threatening to spring forth, but she kept her composure. Will he never believe in me, she thought, feeling frustration growing. I did everything for love, Dona Antonia, no matter what Augusto thinks. Dona Antonia looked at the photo of Augusto again, sadness returning to her eyes. I only want better for what's left of him, and I hope that one day you'll understand, she said softly. Esperanza turned towards the window, her hands trembling. Dona Antonia's words echoed in her mind, creating a mixture of pain and determination. The day Augusto received the cancer diagnosis was still fresh in Esperanza's memory. She remembered every detail, every word said in that cold and impersonal office. What are you saying, doctor? Asked Augusto, his voice broken by disbelief. The doctor sighed, looking at the papers in his hands before facing Augusto and Esperanza. You have terminal cancer, said the doctor calmly. We have some treatment options to prolong your life. He hesitated, searching for the right words, but there is no cure. Esperanza felt the ground disappear under her feet. How is it possible, she thought as panic began to take hold of her. It can't be, she whispered, holding Augusto's hand tightly. Augusto looked at her, his eyes full of fear and sadness. We are going to fight, Esperanza. We are going to try everything we can, he said, trying to find strength in his words. Mrs. Antonia, who was present in the office, felt that her world was falling apart. She held his hand with tears in her eyes. We are here for you, my son. No matter what happens, we are together, she said with a trembling voice. The following days were a whirlwind of consultations, treatments, and faded hopes. Augusto, who had always been the pillar of strength of the family, was now weak and vulnerable. I don't know how we are going to overcome this, Esperanza said one day with a low and tired voice. Esperanza hugged him, feeling the weight of her responsibilities increase. We will get through it, Augusto. One day at a time. I am here with you, she whispered, trying to hide the fear in her voice. But the disease advanced relentlessly. Every day was a battle, and the tension between Esperanza and Dona Antonia grew along with the seriousness of the situation. "You need to rest more, Augusto," Dona Antonia would frequently say with evident concern. Esperanza, exhausted from balancing work and care, was beginning to resent Dona Antonia's constant suggestions. "I am doing the best I can, Mrs. Antonia," she answered, trying to stay calm. The nights were the most difficult. Augusto frequently woke up in pain, and Esperanza stayed by his side, holding his hand and trying to offer comfort. "I just want you to know that I love you," Augusto said with a weak voice but full of sincerity. Esperanza felt the tears rolling down her face, her heart tight. "I love you too, Augusto. I will always love you," she answered, her voice filled with emotion. Mrs. Antonia, upon hearing her son's words, felt a mixture of pain and hope. Will she love him, she thought, skepticism still present but now accompanied by a desperate desire to believe. With time, it became clear that Augusto's fight was coming to an end. He looked at Esperanza and Dona Antonia, his eyes shining with deep love. "Take care of each other, please," he asked, knowing that reconciliation between the two was his last wish. Esperanza and Dona Antonia looked at each other with the implicit promise to do their best to honor the memory of Augusto. "We will do it, Augusto." "For you," said Esperanza, holding his hand firmly. "For you, my son," echoed Dona Antonia, her voice full of emotion. And so, with that promise, they faced the inevitable, united by the pain and love they shared for Augusto. One day, Augusto, pale and weak, breathed with difficulty. Dona Antonia held his hand tightly while Esperanza remained next to the bed, her eyes fixed on her husband. Tears rolled silently down their faces, each one dealing with the pain of saying goodbye in their way. "Mom," Esperanza whispered. Augusto's voice was almost inaudible. "Take care of each other, please." Mrs. Antonia nodded, her heart tight with pain. "We will do it, my son," she said with a choked voice. Esperanza, however, had her eyes fixed on Augusto's face, feeling a mixture of desperation and determination. "We promise, Augusto," she answered, trying to hide the trembling in her voice. The following moments were of silent agony. The heart monitor emitted a continuous sound, indicating that Augusto's heart had stopped beating. Dona Antonia let out a gasp, while Esperanza closed her eyes, allowing the tears to finally fall. "No, Augusto," she murmured. Dona Antonia, her voice full of pain, leaned down and kissed her son's forehead, a gesture of farewell and eternal love. Esperanza moved away from the bed, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions. "He's gone," she thought, trying to understand what would come next. She looked at Dona Antonia, who was on her knees beside the bed, crying silently. "We need to be strong, Dona Antonia," said Esperanza, her voice now firmer. "Augusto wouldn't like to see us like this." Dona Antonia looked up, tears continuing to fall. "He was everything to me, Esperanza. How am I going to live without him?" she asked, her voice choked. Esperanza sighed, feeling the pressure of the next words. "We will get through it, but we need to resolve things, especially about the apartment," she said, trying to seem practical. Dona Antonia looked at her, surprised by the change of tone. "What do you mean?" Esperanza asked, a hint of distrust emerging. Esperanza took a deep breath, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. "Augusto was my husband. I have a right to the apartment. We need to resolve this," she stated, her voice full of determination. The surprise in Dona Antonia's eyes transformed into something more somber. "Esperanza, this apartment is mine and Augusto's. It was bought with our savings before you came into our lives," she said, her voice filled with new tension. Esperanza narrowed her eyes, her expression hardening. "I took care of him until the end. I sacrificed everything. Do you think you deserve more than me?" she questioned, anger beginning to emerge. Dona Antonia stood up, facing Esperanza with renewed strength. It is not a question of deserving, Esperanza. It is a question of justice, and Augusto knew it, she answered firmly. Esperanza, now taken by anger, took a step forward. I'm not going to give up. This apartment is mine, and I'm going to fight for it until the end, she declared. Dona Antonia, seeing the change in Esperanza, felt a pang of sadness mixed with distrust. She's always been like this, she thought, trying to understand the true nature of her daughter-in-law. Then we will have to resolve this the right way, Esperanza said. And may Augusto guide us to do the right thing. The tension between them was palpable, and both knew that the real battle had just begun. The love for Augusto united them, but the conflict over the apartment divided them deeply. The death of Augusto had changed everything, and now only time would tell how this fight for the future would develop. One day, Esperanza was fixing Augusto's room, trying to get through his things and deal with the pain of loss. Each object, each memory, brought a new wave of sadness. It was while rummaging through the bottom of a drawer that she found a small locked box. Curious and anxious, she opened it with a key she found on the nightstand. Inside the box were several letters, all addressed to Augusto. Esperanza took the first one and began to read, feeling a sensation of increasing dread. The words revealed a story she had never imagined. Augusto had a daughter out of wedlock named Sofia. He had her before marrying Esperanza and had kept that secret for years. How could he hide this from me? Esperanza murmured, her heart racing. She continued reading, discovering that Sofia was 10 years old and lived with her mother in another city. Each letter revealed Augusto's love for his daughter, describing his visits and how he wanted to include her more in his life. This is incredible, she said, feeling anger grow. She felt a mix of betrayal and despair. Could it be that Augusto loved me less for this? She thought as tears rolled down her face. Esperanza put the letters back in the box, but the restlessness did not leave her in peace. I need to talk to Mrs. Antonia, she must know about this, she decided as she headed to the living room. Mrs. Antonia was sitting in the armchair, looking at a photo of Augusto. When she saw Esperanza come in, she noticed the disturbed expression of her daughter-in-law. What's wrong? Esperanza asked in a soft but worried voice. Esperanza held the box tightly, her gaze fixed on Mrs. Antonia. Augusto had a daughter, Mrs. Antonia, a daughter who, for all these years, she said with a trembling voice. Dona Antonia was silent for a moment before sighing deeply. Yes, I knew about Sofia, she admitted with sadness evident in her voice. The revelation made Esperanza tremble with anger. And you never told me? Why did you hide it from me? She asked, taking a step forward. Augusto asked me not to say anything. He wanted to protect you all, replied Dona Antonia, looking at Esperanza sadly. I planned to tell you when the time was right. Esperanza felt a wave of fury. And now what will happen to the apartment? She asked with concern evident in her voice. Dona Antonia sighed again. I don't know, Esperanza, but I know that Augusto wanted the best for Sofia. He loved her very much, she said with a firm voice. Esperanza closed her eyes, trying to control her emotions. This girl is going to take everything from me, she thought, feeling a new wave of anger beginning to nourish a resentment towards the girl she had never met. This is not fair, Mrs. Antonia said Esperanza, with a voice full of bitterness. Sofia does not deserve any of this, she added, showing her determination to fight for the apartment. Dona Antonia looked at Esperanza, seeing the change in her expression. Please think about what Augusto would want. He loved Sofia, and she is part of the family, she said, trying to appeal to Esperanza's rational side. But Esperanza was determined. I will do whatever it takes to protect what is mine, she declared in a firm and cold voice. The tension between the two women increased, and both knew that this new conflict had just begun. The discovery of the old letters had revealed painful secrets, and now the fight for the future of the apartment became even more complex and emotional. The atmosphere in the apartment has become increasingly tense since the death of Augusto. Esperanza, who before showed a face of pain and mourning, began to reveal a darker and more aggressive side. Dona Antonia noticed the change but tried to ignore it, hoping that it was just a phase of intense sadness. "Dona Antonia, I already told you that this apartment is mine by right," said Esperanza, with her voice loaded with frustration. She was standing in the middle of the room, with her eyes shining with anger. Dona Antonia sighed deeply, feeling the tiredness weigh on her shoulders. "Esperanza, this apartment was bought with the money that Augusto and I saved." "You know it," she answered, trying to stay calm. "I don't care," shouted Esperanza, taking a threatening step towards Dona Antonia. "I sacrificed everything for Augusto. I worked for him. I took care of him, and now you want to take this from me?" Dona Antonia stepped back, feeling cornered. "Esperanza, please, let's talk like civilized people," she asked with a trembling voice. But Esperanza was beyond reason at that moment. She turned abruptly and began to take Dona Antonia's things, throwing them to the ground with force. "Do you want to talk? Let's talk outside," she said with a voice full of venom. Dona Antonia looked horrified as Esperanza threw her clothes and belongings out the door. "Esperanza, stop with this," she screamed, trying to hold her daughter-in-law's arm. "No, Dona Antonia, you already took everything from me. Now it's my turn," answered Esperanza. Dona Antonia stood, feeling the pain in her body and soul. Tears ran down her face as she watched her belongings being thrown into the street. "What happened to you?" Esperanza thought, with the pain of betrayal tearing at her heart. The neighbors began to come out of their houses, attracted by the noise and the screams. Some looked with sadness, others with curiosity, but no one dared to intervene. "This is between you, I don't want to get involved," muttered one of the neighbors, walking away in a hurry. Dona Antonia, with no other option, began to pick up her things from the street. Each movement was painful, both physically and emotionally. "I can't stay here," she thought while the tears continued to fall. With the help of a kind neighbor, Mrs. Antonia managed to find a small apartment to rent. It was modest, but at least it provided a refuge from Esperanza's aggressiveness. "Thank you for helping me," she said to the neighbor in a voice full of gratitude. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Antonia. Nobody deserves to go through this," the neighbor replied, helping her carry the last boxes. Mrs. Antonia sat in her new house, looking around. Everything was so different, so strange. "How did we get to this?" she thought, feeling the loneliness tightening her heart. She knew she would need time to adapt but was determined to keep going. "I have to be strong," she thought, drying her tears. Meanwhile, back in the apartment, Esperanza felt a mix of relief and guilt. "I did what I had to do," she repeated to herself, trying to convince herself that she had acted correctly. But deep down, she knew that something had changed forever between her and Mrs. Antonia. Esperanza was sitting in the living room of the apartment. The silence around her was almost palpable. She looked around, observing every detail of the place she now considered hers. She felt a sensation of deep relief as if a great weight had been removed from her shoulders. "I finally did it," she thought, feeling victorious. "I did what I had to do," she murmured to herself, a smile of triumph spreading across her face. Expelling Mrs. Antonia had been a necessary step. "She never understood me, she never respected me," she reflected while she ran her hand over the photos of Augusto that were still on the shelves. Victory felt sweet, but there was still much to do. The thought of Sofia, Augusto's daughter, invaded her mind. And that girl, she thought, a wave of worry emerging. Sofia could be an obstacle, but since Augusto never officially recognized her, that will make things difficult for her, she reasoned, feeling more confident. "I have nothing to fear," she said out loud as if reaffirming her conviction. Esperanza knew she needed to protect herself legally. She decided that the best way to ensure her safety was to hire a good lawyer, someone who could argue that Sofia had no right to the apartment or Augusto's property. "I'm going to find the best lawyer in town," she said, standing up with determination. As she thought about her next actions, a Machiavellian idea began to form in her mind. If Sofia or her mother tried something, she would be ready to act. "I already got rid of Dona Antonia, I can do the same with that girl if necessary," she thought with a cold and calculating gleam in her eyes. The possibility of a DNA test worried her, but since Augusto was dead, that became more difficult. Without Augusto to confirm it, it will be more complicated for them to do anything, she reflected, feeling relieved by that advantage. "Nothing is going to take this away from me," she affirmed, her voice cold and determined. Esperanza sat back down, taking the phone to begin her searches. She knew she had to act quickly to ensure that no surprises arose that could hinder her plans. "I'm going to shield my life against any attempt by them," she thought as she dialed the number of a renowned law firm. While waiting on the line, her mind went back to Sofia. "She doesn't even know me, but if she tries anything, she'll find out that I'm willing to do whatever it takes," her thoughts turned more and more somber. She was determined to protect her new beginning at any cost. "Hello, I would like to make an appointment with Dr. Hernandez," she said to the assistant, her voice firm. "It's urgent." After scheduling the appointment, Esperanza got up, feeling more in control. She knew she had to be careful, but she was willing to go to the last consequences to guarantee her safety and stability. "Augusto, I did this for us," she thought, looking at a photo of him. One day, her mind was racing, reflecting on Augusto's will. She knew he had left one, but she was confident that he would have done the right thing and left the apartment for her. "Augusto always said that I was the most important woman in his life," she murmured, a soft smile emerging on her lips as she remembered the promises of love he made. Augusto was a man of sweet words and sincere promises. On many nights, while he was sick, he would hold her hand and talk about how he wanted her to be cared for as she deserved the best after all they had done together. "You are everything to me, Esperanza," he would say with a voice weakened by illness but full of love. "I want you to have a quiet life without worries." Those words resonated in Esperanza's mind like a comforting melody. She believed blindly that the will would reflect those feelings, that he would have guaranteed that the apartment would be hers. "Augusto knew how much I tried, how much I sacrificed for him," she said out loud as if stating this could remove any doubt. She got up and walked through the apartment, running her hand over the furniture and objects that were part of her life with Augusto. Each element told a story of love, struggle, and companionship. "This place is mine," she thought, feeling like the owner of every corner and every memory. But deep down, there was a small hint of insecurity that she refused to admit. "And if he left something for Mrs. Antonia," a voice whispered in her mind, but she quickly pushed those thoughts away. "No, he knew what was right. He knew that I needed this place. He promised me security," she affirmed, feeling more firm. Esperanza could not imagine a scenario in which Augusto had left the apartment to another person. The promises of love, the moments they shared, all pointed to a single truth in her mind: the apartment would be hers. She remembered how he talked about the future, about building something together, about making sure she was always protected. He wouldn't break that promise, she whispered more to herself than anyone else. As the day turned to night, Esperanza felt a mix of anxiety and hope. The day of the will reading was drawing near, and she couldn't wait to see her belief confirmed. "He did the right thing, I know he did," she repeated to herself, trying to keep any shadow of doubt away from her mind. Little did she know what was to come on the day of the reading of the will, a day that would change her life and her certainties forever. The day of the reading of the will arrived, and the lawyer's office was silent, with only the sound of the clock on the wall marking time. Esperanza sat next to Mrs. Antonia, her face a mask of expectation. Both were nervous but for different reasons. Mrs. Antonia held a handkerchief ready to dry the tears that were already threatening to fall. Esperanza, on the other hand, tried to remain calm despite the anxiety that consumed her. Everything is going to change today, she thought with hope regarding the ownership of the apartment and other assets. Augusto left everything to my mother, Antonia read the lawyer. His words echoed like thunder in Esperanza's head. She was stunned, unable to believe what she had just heard. "What?" she exclaimed, her voice full of surprise. "This can't be true. Augusto promised me." The lawyer looked at both of them with compassion. "I understand that this is a shock. Augusto wanted to make sure that his mother was safe," he explained calmly. Esperanza felt the world crumbling around her. "How could he do this to me?" she thought, feeling the tears of rage and despair accumulating. "He said that he would take care of me," she shouted with bitterness. Dona Antonia tried to touch Esperanza's arm, but she pulled away abruptly. "Esperanza, he also wanted the best for you," she said, trying to console her daughter-in-law. "I don't want to hear it," said Esperanza, getting up quickly. "This is not fair. I sacrificed everything for him, and now this," she said, leaving the office with fast and furious steps. Dona Antonia remained seated, tears falling, while the lawyer closed the will. "She did not know that he would do this to me," she murmured, looking at the lawyer. Dona Antonia left the office, feeling a mix of guilt and sadness. "How am I going to deal with this?" she thought as she slowly walked out. She knew the next few weeks would be difficult, but she had no idea how tumultuous they would become. As soon as she finished the reading, Esperanza followed the lawyer, Dr. Hernandez, to his office. Her mind was boiling with thoughts and arguments. "I need to do something, anything to reverse that decision," Esperanza said, rushing into the office. "Dr. Hernandez, this is wrong. Augusto could not have done this to me. He promised me," she exclaimed, her voice full of desperation. Dr. Hernandez looked at her with compassion, but his expression was firm. "Esperanza, I understand how you feel, but the will is clear. Augusto left everything to Mrs. Antonia," he said calmly, sitting behind his desk. "But he was my husband. I took care of him until the last moment. He would not have done this to me," Esperanza insisted, shouting. "I know you were by his side, but legally, he had the right to dispose of his assets as he wished," explained Dr. Hernandez, trying to remain calm in the face of Esperanza's growing agitation. Esperanza began to pace back and forth, her face red with anger. "It can't be. There must be something we can do. Annul the will, do something," she demanded, slamming her hand on the lawyer's desk. Dr. Hernandez sighed, knowing that this would be a difficult conversation. "Esperanza, a will is legally binding. It is a legal document that expresses the wishes of the deceased. Unless there is proof that Augusto was incapacitated or coerced into making the will, it is valid," he said, keeping his voice firm. "Then you are saying that I have no right to anything?" asked Esperanza, her voice trembling with indignation. "That is not it. You can have marital rights, but Augusto's will specifies that he wanted the assets to go to Mrs. Antonia. There is no way to change that legally unless some kind of irregularity is proven, which does not seem to be the case here," answered Dr. Hernandez, trying to be as clear as possible. Esperanza felt the anger bubbling up inside her. Every word the lawyer said sounded like a blow. "This isn't fair," she screamed, completely losing her composure. Esperanza took a step back, feeling defeated. "This isn't over, Dr. Hernandez. I'll find a way," she said with a voice full of cold determination. Dr. Hernandez simply nodded, knowing there was nothing more to say. He watched as Esperanza walked out of the office, the tension in the air almost palpable. The legal battle was lost, but he knew that for Esperanza, the fight had just begun. As she walked through the streets, Esperanza felt the fury growing inside her. "Augusto, how could you do this to me?" she thought as tears rolled down her face. She knew she needed to find another way and wouldn't rest until she secured what she believed was rightfully hers. She decided to change her approach. She called Mrs. Antonia, trying to speak in a calm and understanding manner. "Mrs. Antonia, I need to speak to you personally," she said, trying to seem genuine. On the other end of the line, Mrs. Antonia was surprised by the soft tone. "Esperanza, what is it about?" she asked with a little hope and caution. "I have thought a lot about what happened. Augusto wanted the best for us," Esperanza began, trying to sound sincere. "Maybe we can find a way to solve this together." Dona Antonia, wishing for peace and a resolution, sighed in relief. "I am glad to hear that." Esperanza responded with a touch of emotion in her voice. "I would like to make a memorial for Augusto, something that he would appreciate. We can meet at the cemetery tomorrow to organize it together," suggested Esperanza, trying to seem conciliatory and genuine. Dona Antonia hesitated for a moment, but the desire to honor her son's memory spoke louder. "Yes, I think you would like that. See you there tomorrow," she agreed, feeling a hint of hope. Esperanza hung up the phone, feeling a mix of relief and tension. "This has to work," she thought as she began to plan her next steps. She knew she needed to seem genuine to gain Dona Antonia's trust. Again the next day, Esperanza arrived early at the cemetery. She prepared a special tea, mixing in a mild sedative that she had gotten. It will seem that she simply felt bad, she thought while stirring the tea. When Dona Antonia arrived, Esperanza greeted her with a smile. "Thank you for coming, Dona Antonia. Let's do something nice for her," she said, trying to seem excited. She returned the smile, still cautious but hopeful. "Yes, she deserves it," she replied in a soft voice. Esperanza took the tea out of her bag and offered a cup to Dona Antonia. "I prepared a tea to warm us up while we organize everything," she said, handing her the cup. Dona Antonia accepted the tea with gratitude. "Thank you, Esperanza. That is very kind of you," she said, without suspecting anything. As Mrs. Antonia drank the tea, Esperanza watched her carefully. "It is working," she thought, seeing that Mrs. Antonia was beginning to feel sleepy. "I think I need to rest a little," said Mrs. Antonia, yawning. Esperanza helped Mrs. Antonia to lie down in the car seat. "Rest, Mrs. Antonia. I will take care of everything," she said in a soft voice, with a smile of triumph. With Mrs. Antonia asleep, Esperanza drove to a nursing home she had investigated. "I have an elderly lady who needs care. She has no family and needs a safe place," she said to the employee, handing over the falsified documentation. After leaving Mrs. Antonia at the nursing home, Esperanza returned to the apartment feeling relieved. "Now I will finally have what is rightfully mine," she thought as she closed the door behind her. The plan seemed perfect, but Esperanza knew she had to be careful. No one should suspect anything, she thought as she began to plan her next steps to make sure the apartment was hers once and for all. Dona Antonia slowly woke up with a heavy head and cloudy eyes. The environment around her was strange, the antiseptic smell and the white walls of the room were unfamiliar to her. She tried to get up, but her body seemed weak. She looked around, trying to understand where she was. "Where am I?" she murmured in a weak and confused voice. A nurse entered the room, seeing that Mrs. Antonia was awake. "Good morning, madam. You are in the San Jose asylum," she said with a comforting smile. Mrs. Antonia frowned, her confusion growing. "But how? How did I get here?" she asked, trying to piece things together. The nurse looked at her with sympathy. "A young woman brought you last night. She said you needed care and that you had no one else to take care of you," she explained. Mrs. Antonia felt a wave of panic. "Esperanza. She brought me here," she thought, the truth finally clearing in her mind. "I need to get out of here." "This is a mistake," she said, trying to get up again. "Calm down, ma'am. You are still weak. We will call someone to talk to you," answered the nurse, helping her to lie down again. Meanwhile, in the apartment, Esperanza was sitting in the living room, savoring a cup of coffee. I finally got what is rightfully mine, she thought, feeling a sense of triumph. The house was silent, and she felt in control. Augusto, I did this for us, she murmured, looking at a picture of her deceased husband. Now I can finally live in peace. But Esperanza's peace was interrupted by the sound of the phone. She answered, trying to hide the irritation in her voice. Hello, Esperanza. I'm Vicente. Can we talk? Said the voice on the other end of the line. Esperanza tried to remain calm. Of course, Vicente. What did you need? Although a feeling of uneasiness was beginning to grow, Vicente replied, I prefer to talk in person. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Vicente said, hanging up before Esperanza could answer. Esperanza felt a stab of nervousness. What does he want now, she thought, trying to prepare for the conversation. She knew she had to keep up the calm facade so as not to arouse suspicion. 15 minutes later, Vicente arrived at the apartment. He entered with a serious expression, which made Esperanza feel a chill. Esperanza, we need to talk about Mrs. Antonia, Vicente began bluntly. Esperanza tried to look surprised. What happened to her? She asked with an expression of false concern. Vicente looked her straight in the eyes. She is in a nursing home, Esperanza, and she doesn't understand how she got there, he said, watching every reaction of Esperanza. Esperanza felt her heart race but kept her voice firm. I only wanted the best for her. Vicente was weak and needed care, she justified herself, trying to seem sincere. Esperanza worked at the San Jose nursing home. I saw when you brought Mrs. Antonia, revealed Vicente with an expression of discontent. The revelation made Esperanza turn pale. Someone from the nursing home knew Mrs. Antonia. What? She exclaimed, her voice full of disbelief. Yes, Esperanza. And what you did was unacceptable, said Vicente, his voice firm. You can't just abandon Mrs. Antonia there and hope that no one will alert her and they will investigate this. The news hit Esperanza like a blow. How could I do this, she thought, feeling the panic grow. You don't understand, Vicente. I was trying to protect what is mine, said Esperanza, her voice full of desperation. Vicente looked at her with compassion. There is always a choice, Esperanza, and you chose the wrong path, he said before leaving the apartment. Esperanza was left alone in the living room, feeling the weight of her actions. What have I done, she thought, feeling guilt and desperation mix. The news that the police were involved made her realize that her plan was falling apart. She knew she needed to prepare to face the consequences of her actions, but she wasn't ready to admit defeat. At the asylum, the police arrived shortly after Vicente's call. They spoke with Mrs. Antonia, who explained what she remembered and how she had been taken to the place. The police, realizing the seriousness of the situation, promised to investigate thoroughly. We will take you back home, Mrs. Antonia, said one of the policemen, helping her to get up. Mrs. Antonia, although still weak, felt a wave of relief. I am going to return home. Esperanza will not be able to push me away so easily, she thought, feeling her strength return slowly. As they took her back to the apartment, Dona Antonia knew that the real battle was just beginning. She was determined to regain her place and the justice that Augusto wanted, and Esperanza, despite her actions, would have to face the truth and the consequences of her decisions. Esperanza was sitting in the living room, trying to control the storm of thoughts that was going through her mind. Vicente's revelation and the imminent visit from the police left her on the verge of panic. I need to think of something, she thought, feeling the desperation growing. Suddenly, the sound of the doorbell made her jump. Esperanza, open the door. It's the police, said an authoritative voice on the other side of the door. She hesitated for a moment but knew she had no choice. She walked to the door with her heart beating hard and opened it slowly. Mrs. Esperanza, we need to talk to you about Mrs. Antonia, said one of the policemen, looking at her seriously. I was taking care of her. She was weak and needed special care, said Esperanza, trying to sound convincing, but her voice was shaking. We received information that she was put in an asylum against her will. We have witnesses and evidence, said the policeman, showing the seriousness of the situation. Esperanza felt the ground disappear under her feet. Could this happen? She thought, trying to find words. I just wanted the best for her, she said, but her voice sounded weaker with each word. We have an arrest warrant for attempted fraud and theft. Esperanza is accused of trying to appropriate Mrs. Antonia's property, said the policeman as another began to put the handcuffs on Esperanza. She felt tears roll down her face. This can't be happening. I was just trying to protect what was rightfully mine, she said, her voice full of desperation. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court, said the policeman, reciting Esperanza's rights as they led her out of the apartment. The neighbors looked through the half-open door, murmuring amongst themselves. Esperanza felt the shame burn her skin. How could I have come to this, she thought as she was placed in the police car. On the way to the station, Esperanza tried to find some solace, but all seemed lost. Augusto, forgive me, she thought as the tears continued to fall. She knew her plan had fallen apart and that now she would face the consequences of her actions. The court was packed on the day of Esperanza's trial. The sound of murmurs echoed off the walls as people waited for the verdict. Esperanza sat next to her lawyer, who tried to remain calm, but the fear was evident in her eyes. The defendant may rise, the judge said with an authoritative voice. Esperanza stood up with trembling hands. The judge looked directly at her with a stern expression. Mrs. Esperanza, after analyzing all the evidence and testimony, this court finds you guilty of attempted fraud and theft, the judge said as Esperanza felt that the world was falling apart. You are sentenced to 10 years in prison, the judge concluded, banging the gavel. Esperanza felt an overwhelming weight fall on her shoulders. 10 years. How am I going to survive, she thought as the guards escorted her out of the court. She looked at Mrs. Antonia, who was sitting in the audience with tears in her eyes. I never wanted it to come to this, Esperanza said. I only wanted to protect what was mine, Esperanza murmured, her voice choked with tears. The days in prison were long and lonely. Esperanza spent hours thinking about everything she had lost and how her life had come to this point. Augusto, forgive me for not being strong enough, she thought as she looked at the ceiling of the cell. The routine in prison was hard. Esperanza was forced to face her actions and the reality of her decisions. The food was tasteless, the conditions were difficult, and the loneliness was overwhelming. I did this to myself, she thought, feeling the pain of guilt and regret. Outside the walls of the penitentiary, Dona Antonia and Sofia, now a teenager, saw each other regularly, creating a deep and comforting bond. Sofia, although sad for not having met her father, found joy and comfort in the loving presence of her grandmother, Dona Antonia. For her part, Dona Antonia felt a serene happiness to be with her granddaughter, feeling the presence of Augusto every time she looked into the young woman's eyes as if a part of him was still there and alive. If you appreciated this story, please leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your comment telling us your opinion about the story. Your support is very important to us. And now, on your screen, another exciting story is appearing for you. Good session.